This is Doug Smith. While he's an independent consultant, he has over 40 years of experience, 70 publications, and you'll love this in the fields of genetics, DNA sequencing, technology development, and bioinformatics. Doug's research experience includes numerous federally funded technology development and genome sequencing projects. He led one of the large-scale sequencing centers that helped decode the human genome and was involved in many other pioneering genome projects, as well as the development of commercial applications. Doug is also keenly interested in understanding the spiritual beings and events that lie behind the phenomena of the physical world. And as such, he has been a student of anthroposophy and Christology for nearly as long as his professional career. It's been a great pleasure knowing Doug, and he's been part of this planning committee. So I hope you will welcome Doug Smith.
So I'll begin by highlighting some anthroposophical teachings on heredity, reincarnation, and karma. And then I'll summarize some of the major developments in the study of genomics and genetic disease. And I'll highlight some advances in genetic technology and promising results of clinical trials for gene therapy to treat some severe genetic disorders. We will look briefly at the current trends in vitro fertilization technology and world population, and then we'll delve into the phenomenon of transhumanism and see what it seeks to bring in terms of transforming humanity using genetic technologies. Finally, we'll consider some of the key ethical issues and that this raises and indications for the future of humanity in the light of spiritual science. So in the next few slides, I'll summarize some teachings of real science that relate to heredity, reincarnation, and karma. The impulses of heredity come through the Father. Our natural science, which is focused on the kingdom of nature, is actually just a one-sided science of the Father, the natural kingdom of the Father. Heredity and death do not originate in the sense world. The materialist view perpetuates the idea that human existence is purely a sense world phenomenon, but our true origin and destiny are, of course, in the spirit. We shape that destiny as individuals to a greater or lesser degree, depending on our spiritual development. We choose the nationality, culture, parents, and body that we're born into. Heredity is connected with the mysteries of karma and birth, and death really represents a birth into the spiritual world. When speaking of a child, we must distinguish between the body of heredity, which is the model, and the individual body that is its successor. The individual body, the personal body of the human being, develops by degrees. Between the 7th and 14 years is the strongest activity of which the individual is capable that goes forward. Either the individuality conquers the forces of heredity during this period and begins to work his way out of them, or the individuality remains subject to the forces of heredity. And in the second case, the hereditary likeness to the parents simply continues beyond the 7th year, but it all depends upon the strength of the individuality and not the forces of heredity. Science of the Son of Christ is connected with the way human beings take hold of themselves to be psychically reborn and transported out of the kingdom of nature and into the kingdom of the spirit. The impulses of the Son must be taken up and elaborated by the soul in order to free itself from the body and hereditary forces. They enable the human beings to control themselves during life, which is given by the Father. Those who become children of the Father, brothers and sisters of Christ, gain control over that part of themselves which is free from the body. They manifest a new realm within them, the realm of the spirit, which is different, a different order than nature. Hereditary forces, which derive from the Father forces that have been secreted into nature, influence the way we live our lives and are intimately connected with human destiny. The results of the previous earth life continuously plays into us when we act, so that as we act, we bring the spirit into the physical corporeality which we have acquired in our present existence. Anthroposophy can help us understand the impact of repeated Earth lives, and manage the impulses connected with the heredity and the father forces as we stand in the outer world with our actions in life. So this slide shows a few relationships as described in various ways and context by Rudolf Steiner. We can imagine that the relationship between the realms of the Father and the Spirit is analogous to a series of expanding circles from each one which meet at infinity. Christ, who's present in the life of nature, is the mediator between the realms of the Father and the Spirit. Okay, so let's delve deeper into this natural science of the Father and take some look at some major developments and discoveries in human genetics and genomics. These will provide a basis to understand what transhumanism might be capable of, and I promise we'll return to some anthroposophy later on. So in May 2000, the initial sequencing of the human genome was announced at a major event at the White House. I was leading one of the labs that contributed to the project at the time and was actually there in the room when the announcement was made. Sequencing the human genome was a landmark achievement for science. It was the culmination of a decade of work by a large number of individuals throughout the world. In the 20 years that have elapsed since that time, advances in DNA sequencing technology have continued at an accelerated pace, reducing the cost per genome from about $100 million to less than $1,000. One sequencing technology company announced this year that it plans to reduce the cost to $100 per genome. This reduction in costs and actually increase in throughput has inspired several large-scale sequencing projects that collectively plan to sequence and analyze the genomes of over 3 million people over the next 3 to 5 years. The information that will be gained by studying the genomes of such a large number of individuals will enable us to learn a great deal about human evolution, inherited traits, and disease. Our body is made up of about 37 trillion cells of about 200 major cell types. Each one of those cells contains 2 copies of the genome, or about 6 billion base pairs of DNA. The 2 copies in our cells are derived from our parents through genetic inheritance. DNA is an information molecule, and the information it contains in the sequence of nucleotides is used to build up the physical structure of all the cells in our body. The genome contains about 20,000, encodes about 20,000 proteins and a similar number of major regulatory RNAs. It encodes many different isoforms of each gene, which are expressed in different cell types. Over 266,000 such isoforms have been characterized, which is a lot of information. So what have we learned about genetic variation, changes in individual nucleotides in the genome? In terms of diversity, humans differ on average by about 1 change in every 1,000 base pairs, or about 0.1%. About 90% of known genetic variants can be found in all populations throughout the world, in all countries. Only about 10% of variants are population specific. Most of the sequence variants in the genome have little or no apparent effect, but there are many common disorders and complex traits that are affected by changes in these common variants. For example, high blood pressure, psychiatric disorders, height, and intelligence, just to name a few. While each variant may have only a small effect, the combined effects of tens to hundreds of different variants can be significant. In contrast, approximately 80% of rare diseases are caused by single variants in specific genes that have very large effects. There are nearly 7,000 rare diseases that affect more than 25 million Americans, about half children. Variants associated with rare diseases are associated with the rare diseases and a large number of specific genes have been identified for those. Geneticists can trace the prehistoric movements of populations across the world through analysis of genetic variants in ancestral populations and in DNA recovered from ancient bones up to 45,000 years old in some cases. From this, we can identify genetic variants in modern humans that were selected in various populations or inherited through interbreeding of humans and closely related species like Neanderthals. Variant analysis can also be used to trace ancestry across modern populations, as many know, because of the popular services like Ancestry.com. Modern humans derive from ancient African populations that migrated out of Africa over 55,000 years ago. And it's interesting to actually compare some of the things that Rudolf Steiner said about the colonies that came out of Atlantis and some of these migration pathways. Genetic disorders have a significant impact on human health. For example, it has been estimated that 20 to 30% of infant deaths are due to genetic disorders, and 30 to 50% of post-neonatal deaths are due to congenital malformations. Similarly, a significant percentage of pediatric hospitalizations involve genetic disorders, and about 50% of individuals with intellectual disability have a genetic basis for their disease. About 12% of adult hospitalizations are for genetic causes, and many chronic diseases and cancers have a significant genetic component. Rare single gene disorders occur with a prevalence of about 1 in 100 births. They are more than twice as common in the Eastern Mediterranean region due to social acceptance of consanguineous marriages. In many Arab countries, for example, the first cousin marriages may reach 25 to 30% of all marriages, which is surprising. You can see the difference it makes. There are numerous examples of genes where mutations have both positive and negative effects. For example, hemoglobin variants that cause sickle cell disease and several other severe diseases also confer resistance to malaria. Variants in 3 genes associated with darker skin pigmentation, which protects against UV radiation and skin cancer, are selected against in northern populations because there is less sun exposure. But UV radiation is also required for vitamin D biosynthesis, which is an essential nutrient. Variants in the CCR5 gene are associated with resistance to HIV and smallpox, but those same variants weaken memory T cell immune responses and lower resistance to influenza and West Nile virus. There are hundreds of loci in the human genome that show a significant signal of recent positive selection in specific populations. This is the genomic signature of evolution in action. Human head size is another trait where genes have been found to have both positive and negative effects. Head size is determined by rapid growth in the first years of life. There are numerous complex developmental processes involved, which are regulated by many genes and growth pathways. A recent large genetic study found that 67 genetic loci influence head size, independent of height. These loci are enriched for genes that are involved in macrocephaly syndromes, up to 37-fold, and cancer, up to 9-fold. Thus, many of the genes that regulate early brain and cranial growth are associated with propensity to cancer later in life. Finally, let's take a quick look at intelligence and longevity, 2 specific traits that transhumanists are interested in. Intelligence has substantial heritability, about 54%. A 2008 genetic study found 47 intelligence-associated genes, many of which are involved in cell regulation and neuronal function. Studies in centenarians, those are people older than 100 years, or supercentenarians, people older than 110, have resulted in some interesting findings and trends, but not very many associated genes so far. For example, these people have lower than expected incidence of chronic illness, inflammation, and oxidative stress, and specific variants in 2 genes, ApoE and FOXO3, are enriched, and those variants are different from the ones that are associated with Alzheimer's and vascular disease from ApoE. So let's move over to gene therapy, get a picture of that. Most rare genetic diseases have no approved therapies, and there are many of those are life-threatening or serious conditions. Gene therapy-related research and development in the area of rare disease has been an active area of research over the past 20 years and is now beginning to show some promising results. Research in this area is growing at a rapid rate. Developing safe and effective therapeutics to treat rare diseases is very challenging and expensive. Gene therapy patients require long-term follow-up to monitor effectiveness and the possibility of delayed adverse events. There are currently 277 clinical trials for gene therapies that are either active or recruiting patients, and a similar number of additional trials that have already been completed. There are just a couple of promising, here are a couple of promising candidates that are showing positive results. There is Zolgensma for the treatment of spinal muscular atrophy in young children. In this therapy, a non-replicating virus vector is used to deliver a functional survival motor neuron gene into the patient's cells, and this is effective in relieving the symptoms of the disease. Zolgensma is another one that was approved by the FDA this year, the cost of the therapy is around $2 million. It's one of the most expensive therapies ever developed. But the drug company justifies it in terms of the costs of treating patients being $750,000 per treatment. And this only has to be done once. Another treatment, Zynteglo, is showing promising results for transfusion-dependent beta thalassemia and severe sickle cell disease. And in this case, an anti-sickling variant of the hemoglobin gene is introduced into stem cells of the patient, and the cells are transplanted back into the patient's bone marrow for the treatment. So another approach is CRISPR gene editing, which you see in the news a lot. CRISPR is a defense protein that protects bacterial cells from viruses by destroying the viral DNA after infection. It has been repurposed and modified by geneticists to enable gene editing. Different modes have been developed that have various advantages and disadvantages, and all of them are capable of targeting a single site in the human genome to introduce specific mutations, but all of them can also cause off-target mutations at other sites in the genome. So CRISPR editing is a very powerful tool, but it requires caution in its use. There are 12 ongoing, either recruiting or active clinical trials using gene editing for gene therapy. 2 of those have been, and 2 others have been completed. There are 2 general approaches. One is an approach, in vivo approach, where a CRISPR reagent that targets a particular tissue or cell type is administered directly to a patient, and an ex vivo approach, where cells from the patient are edited in the lab and then introduced back into the patient. In 2018, 2 babies with a CCR5 gene deletion were born after in vitro fertilization and CRISPR gene editing of the embryos. It set a firestorm of controversy in the scientific community and the general public, and the scientist who led the project was fired from his position and eventually jailed. But the Pandora's box of human gene editing was opened. Since then, the American Society of Human Genetics, the world's largest community of human genetics professionals with about 8,000 members, put out a position statement on germline gene editing, which you may find surprising in some respects. The statement says, at this time, given the nature of unanswered scientific, ethical, and policy questions, it's inappropriate to perform germline editing that culminates in human pregnancy. Currently, there's no reason to prohibit in vitro germline genome editing on human embryos and gametes, with appropriate oversight and consent from donors to facilitate research on the possible future clinical applications of gene editing. There should be no prohibition on making public funds available to support this research. Future clinical application of human germline genome editing should not proceed unless, at a minimum, there's a compelling medical rationale or an evidence base that supports its clinical use, an ethical justification, and a transparent public process to solicit and incorporate stakeholder input. So what about in vitro fertilization technology? In 2018, there were about 306,000 cycles performed at about 456 reporting clinics across the United States that resulted in about 74,000 live births and over 81,000 live-born infants. About a third of those were egg or embryo banking cycles where the eggs or embryos were frozen for future use. The use of IVF has almost doubled over the last decade, and approximately almost 2% of all infants born in the United States every year are conceived using IVF. The rate has been going up and down in different countries, but it's a popular procedure. The success rate of IVF drops off significantly with age, and it's not recommended for older women. Additional factors that affect the success rate are add-ons such as embryo selection, by pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, ovarian stimulation, freezing, and embryo banking. Finally, I'd like to mention another genetic technology that could have a significant impact in our world. It's called gene drive technology, and it can change entire populations. CRISPR and gene silencing technologies can be used to drive selected traits through whole populations in just a few generations, including killer genes designed to drive species to extinction, like the mosquitoes that carry malaria, for example. Beneficial applications are anticipated by scientists in areas of human health, agriculture, nature conservation, to mitigate or eliminate various pests, diseases, and invasive plant species. The majority of gene drive applications involve genetic engineering of novel traits. Research dollars are flowing and trials are taking place, but without release of gene drive organisms into the environment so far. Some scientists and bioethicists have considered the concept of gene drives in humans. Gene drives in humans would take a long time, up to centuries, because of our long generation time. Gene drive proponents argue that they would be low risk because the genes would be so slow to spread in a population that there would be time to create and release an immunizing reversal drive if they needed to. But there is significant potential for negative outcomes, including long-term unintended consequences and off-target effects. Bioethicists have now started to grapple with the ethical issues around this. So, all right, so now that you've endured my crash course in human genetics and technology, let's consider transhumanism. What is it? What do transhumanists want to do with genetics, and why is it catching on? The concept of transhumanism was coined by a British evolutionary biologist, Sir Julian Huxley, in 1957. He said the human species can, if it wishes, transcend itself. Man will remain man, but transcending himself by realizing new possibilities of and for his human nature. I believe in transhumanism. Once there are enough people who can truly say that the human species will be on the threshold, who can say that, the human species will be on the threshold of a new kind of existence, as different from ours as ours is from Peking man. It will be the last and consciously, it will at last be consciously fulfilling its real destiny. Transhumanism focuses on technologies that can enhance normal human functions to create advanced or artificially enhanced humans. Post-humanism goes further to include machine humans, biotechnological non-humans, and conscious in silico entities with general artificial intelligence. For this talk, I will focus just on transhumanism and its ability to modify humans using genetic technologies, or its aims. For millennia, the desire to overcome normal human capacities and achieve a more perfect ideal has captured the human imagination. Witness epic tales of humans with godlike powers, eternal life, and the 20th century phenomenon of comic book superheroes. The goal of improving the human condition and overall health has been the primary driver for biomedical innovation. The emergence of new technologies has provided a means to transition from external modifications like prostheses to genetic ones that can be made permanent and transmissible. The eugenics movement of the 19th and 20th centuries sought to improve the human race, but resorted to crude methods like sterilization and genocide, known as negative eugenics. Sir Francis Galton sought to improve populations through selective breeding and negative eugenics. Alfred Ploetz founded the German Society of Racial Hygiene, and his ideas on the superiority of the Aryan race strongly influenced Nazi leaders. We know where that led. Charles Davenport founded the Eugenics Record Office at Cold Spring Harbor, New York. He broadly promoted eugenics views in the US and worldwide, and it gained many followers. In 2001, Julian Savulescu published his Principle of Procreative Beneficence. It says, in relation to in vitro fertilization and pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, that couples or single reproducers should select the child of the possible children they could have who is expected to have the best life, or at least as good a life as the others, based on the relevant available information. He argues that selection for non-disease genes which significantly impact on well-being is morally required. Such traits would include things like intelligence, memory, self-discipline, or impulse control. He also says that procreative beneficence is not the same as eugenics because it is a parental decision aimed at producing the best child and not a public policy promoting sterilization of less worthy individuals. Most prominent transhumanists readily adopt Savulescu's concept of procreative beneficence. They believe that rational evolution governed by conscious design should replace natural selection, which is random and painfully slow. They believe strongly that it's a matter of personal choice to pursue transhumanist genetic modifications. Many ethicists do not agree with Savulescu, however. An example is Ronald Green, Professor Emeritus of Religion and Ethics at Dartmouth College. He fully supports the use of the reproductive use of gene editing technology for the prevention and elimination of serious genetic diseases, and believes that in the case of severe diseases, we also have a moral obligation to do so. He does not see this extending to optional genetic interventions, however, like the enhancements that would affect appearance, strength, athleticism, or intelligence. Nick Bostrom, a professor at Oxford University and influential author, is a strong proponent of transhumanism. He describes it as an interdisciplinary approach to understanding and evaluating the opportunities for enhancing the human condition and the human organism opened up by the advancement of technology. The enhancement options he envisions include radical extension of human health span, eradication of disease, elimination of unnecessary suffering, and augmentation of human intellectual, physical, and emotional capacities. He asserts that human nature is a work in progress, a half-baked beginning that we can learn to remold in desirable ways. Current humanity need not be the end point of evolution. Bostrom also writes about posthumanism and the possibility of creating super-intelligent machines, along with other potential developments that could radically alter the human condition. Here are a couple of quotes from some other visionary and popular transhumanists. David Wood of London Futurists says, "Transhumanism will grant us awesome powers to proactively remake humanity. We can transcend our original biological nature and become as if divine. We'll be as far ahead of current human capacities as current humans exceed the prowess of their ape forebears." David Pierce of Humanity Plus says, "If we want eternal life, then we'll need to rewrite our bug-ridden genetic code and become godlike. Only high-tech solutions can ever eradicate suffering from the world. Compassion alone is not enough." There are now several major countries with transhumanist political parties, including the UK, the US, Australia, Germany, Canada, and Russia. Zoltan Istvan of the US Transhumanist Party was a candidate for governor of California in 2018 and for the Republican presidential nomination this year. He says, "The bold code of transhumanism will rise. That's an inevitable and undeniable fact. We are the future, like it or not, and it needs to be molded, guided, and handled correctly by the strength and wisdom of transhuman scientists." The Transhumanist Bill of Rights, which you can find on the US Transhumanist Party webpage, includes an interesting declaration of rights that apply to all sentient entities, including genetically modified humans and a variety of imagined future entities like cyborgs, digital intelligences, intellectually enhanced animals and plants, and other advanced sapient life forms. Not clear what he's referring to in the last one, angels or aliens perhaps, but you can be the judge. So have you noticed that all the people I've mentioned so far in connection with eugenics and transhumanism are men? Here's a perspective from a member of the other half of humanity. Transhumanist literature is written by white men and seems directed toward their specific concerns, with little regard to its potential ableist, sexist, and racist impacts. In the social milieu of prenatal testing, one receives the impression that reproduction would be perfected if women were not involved at all. The womb is a risky place for the fetus to gestate. The fetus is transformed into a site of risk, an and autonomous reproducers should embrace their role as risk managers in order to stave off undesirable outcomes. And here's a more spiritual perspective from Agneta Sutton, who's a senior lecturer in moral theology at the University of Chichester. Advocates of parental autonomy, resulting in the child being reduced to a product of human design, are not seeing and treating the child as an equal. Rejecting the old eugenics, the transhumanist movement is nonetheless endorsing what is called soft eugenics, but which is anything but soft. It seeks the elimination of undesired traits in the unborn, and therewith the elimination of those who bear them. The person who is yet to be, the child to be, is a matter of choice of the individuals who are already in existence. Like Prometheus, who reached for and stole the flame of fire from Zeus, they reach not only for superhuman powers, but they reach for godlike powers over life and death. The materialist view of transhumanism seems to carry all the way through to the making of moral decisions. Savulescu and Person state, human beings are not by nature equipped with a moral psychology that empowers them to cope with the moral problems of modern society. In another paper, they posit the existence by 2045 of a God machine that would monitor the thoughts, beliefs, desires, and intentions of every human being. It would be an activist God intervening with its almighty power when a threshold of some sentient being's interests was crossed. In a paper on ethical issues in advanced artificial intelligence, Nick Bostrom said, to the extent that ethics is a cognitive pursuit, a superintelligence could also easily surpass humans in the quality of its moral thinking. This is what we are up against. So where are we headed? Let's return to spiritual science, starting with some things Rudolf Steiner said about cosmic forces in human procreation and development. Sun and moon forces play a strong role in procreation and development from the cellular level up to the macro level of the whole body. Sun forces stream inward from the periphery on the sun's rays. They enable the human being to become a bearer of the ego, the individuality or I. They mold the human form into an image of the ego. They give form to the embryo, developing in the mother's womb from outside. They give birth to us as an individuality. Moon forces, on the other hand, radiate outward from the metabolic center within the organism. They shape the human being from inside out, working by attraction to mold the human countenance. They lead substance over into the realm of the living. They stimulate the inner reproductive processes of the organism to give rise to procreation, reproduction, and propagation, the forming of the so-called human race. So they work in polar antithesis to each other, but their interaction gives rise to the whole being of humanity. The sun places us as an individual on the earth, while the moon charms the whole human race down to earth. These cosmic forces of sun and moon also act on the developing embryo at the level of individual cells. The sun forces stream inward from the periphery, bringing formative forces which are expressed physically in terms of the cellular context within the organism. These forces act on the cell nucleus to regulate gene expression, which in turn determines the cell's individuality or cell type. Moon forces act from the center outwards. In the cell, this leads to messenger RNA expression, which in turn directs the production of specific proteins to build up the substance of the cell. Of course, there's a lot of biochemistry involved, but these are some of the basic ways the forces manifest. In contrast to the moon forces, which give rise to the physical forces of heredity, reproduction, and building up of the organism, the highest cosmic moral forces come from Saturn. Saturn is the source of cosmic equity, the great restorer of the balance for all that happens upon Earth. Saturn forces enter into our lives through all that lives in karma, from incarnation to incarnation, which you can also think of as holding a kind of cosmic memory of our entire planetary system. Saturn forces also mediate the connection between the astral body and the ego, They regulate the integration of the astral body in the whole upper part of the human organization. Spiritual entities are involved when human beings are born and enter this physical world, and then again when they leave it for the non-physical world. These elemental spirits of birth and death are also serving technology, industry, and human commerce. Scientists are influenced and guided by these spirits in laboratories and workshops wherever the spirit of invention is active. These spirits are providing the inspiration. However, these elemental spirits are the enemies of everything human beings seek and desire for their welfare and well-being here in the physical world. They are messengers of Ahriman, and we need to understand where they are leading us. By the way, here's a question. Why do you suppose we always depict a eureka moment by a light bulb going off in our head? We're now living in the fifth post-Atlantean cultural age, the age of the consciousness soul, which began in 1413 and will last for another 1500 years or so. In a nutshell, the task of this age is to develop an awareness of the truth that can permeate our shadowy intellect and enable a living perception of the spiritual within the universe. It represents an evolving impulse to consciously open up ourselves to the life of the spirit. As the age of the consciousness soul progresses, the human soul will withdraw more and more from the body. More and more, we will encounter people whose bodies are empty to such an extent that a powerful Ahrimanic spirit can live in them. Their individualities will be suppressed. Such people will consider it pathological for anyone to even think in terms of soul and spirit. Rudolf Steiner even said that they would develop a medicine to treat this. I think our modern antipsychotic drugs fall into this category. The struggle with evil is intimately connected with the development of the consciousness soul. Our commercial, industrial, and technological civilization harbors elements that will lead to the decline and fall of this post-Atlantean epoch, just as the misuse of elemental creative powers in the Atlantean epoch led to the destruction of that civilization. We are engaged in something that will lead to catastrophe. The only way to counteract this is for human beings to take up the impulses that come from spiritual knowledge. 2,000 years ago, the Christ impulse was born out of the forces of death for the salvation of humanity. Through the experience of evil in the present age, Christ is again able to appear again in the etheric body. And I think that actually echoes something that Boyd told us. I would like to call to mind Rudolf Steiner's teachings on Sorat, the Antichrist sun demon, which corresponds to the beast described by St. John in the book of Revelation. This intensely evil being has made 3 attacks during the last 1400 years, one in 666, one in 1332, and one in our own time at the turn of the millennium. Each of these attacks was focused on preventing human beings from attaining a true understanding of the Christ impulse. I will focus on the last one at the turn of the millennium, the echoes of which are still playing out today. Rudolf Steiner indicated that Sorat's primary goal would be to prevent us from having any experience of Christ in the etheric by promoting sensuous passions, a kind of soulless, self-centered materialism, and by trying to deceive us into believing that the core consciousness of our I is a product of the physical sense world. These ideas are very prevalent today. I think we can also see these impulses expressed in the thoughts of transhumanists. The rise of transhumanism could well be a Sorat impulse. Rudolf Steiner described the ideas of eugenics as the rumblings of brains emptied of soul, an echo of ancient Atlantean science, which had to be withdrawn from humanity because of misuse through the blackest of black magic. I think this also applies, perhaps to a greater extent, to the ideas of transhumanism. So May of the year 2000 was the date that the sequencing of the human genome was announced. There was also a major alignment of the sun, moon, and major planets in the constellation of Aries at that time. In addition, there was the great conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn later the same month. Of course, there are many other things that happened around that time But this is one that people may not have considered, an important event in the evolution of humanity with high potential for both good and evil. Astrosopher Willie Sucher described great conjunctions as a meeting between Saturn, the cosmic memory of all that has happened in the past, and Jupiter, the divine creative thoughts of what is to come. In the present age, those divine creative thoughts include the revelation of Christ in the etheric and the ideas of spiritual science. Great conjunctions happen every 20 years, and we will have another one at the time of the winter solstice this year. We can anticipate a strong deepening of inward spiritual forces when this occurs. So here are some questions to consider concerning the subjects of genetics and transhumanism we have been considering. Efforts to eliminate inherited genetic disease will undoubtedly continue and accelerate. How will this affect incarnating souls who seek to resolve their karma? How will it affect the evolution of humanity? Selection of desirable transhumanist traits is likely to occur at some point, probably not very far off. Will it hinder the overcoming of hereditary forces and expression of the individuality in childhood and beyond? Will it affect the development of spiritual thinking and perception? How will it affect incarnating souls? Finally, as discoveries in genetics continue, will genetic determinism take over? Will people come to believe that all human characteristics and susceptibility to disease are simply a result of their genetics, leaving no role for the individuality and the spirit? Rudolf Steiner warned that the application of genetic selection to human beings would lead to great monstrosities. He said that when esoteric truths that will be revealed during the fifth post-Atlantean era are added to genetic selection, an unbelievable power over human beings will be gained through always selecting the fit. It is not only that the fit will be selected, but the striving for a certain esoteric invention to make the fit always more fit would lead to a tremendous exploitation of power that would oppose precisely the good tendencies of the fifth post-Atlantean period. Does this remind you at all of gene drives, transhumanism, and superintelligence? Bostrom predicts the brains doing the AI research will become AIs themselves. Will those same brains also be directing the genetic experiments? In the seventh post-Atlantean cultural age, the time will come when human beings no longer incarnate in bodies derived from physical parents. In that age, women will be infertile and children will no longer be born in the manner of today, if evolution takes its normal course. Human beings will instead begin a different relationship with the earth as beings of soul and spirit, living and moving in the clouds, rain, lightning, and thunder. They will pulsate, as it were, through the manifestations of nature for an additional 2,500 years. In a still later epoch, their relationship to the earth will become even more spiritual. But it is also possible that something else happens. Alternatively, our harmonic powers, which are becoming extremely strong today, might succeed in preventing the rightful course of Earth evolution. It would then become possible for human beings, by no means for their good, to be held in the same form of physical life beyond this time in the 6th or 7th millennium. Human beings will become much more like animals while continuing to be held in the grip of physical incarnation. One of the endeavors of the harmonic powers is to keep humanity fettered too long on the earth in order to divert it from its normal evolution. Is this where transhumanism is leading us? So I submit to you that we need to be seeking a different kind of transhumanism, one based on the development of spiritual qualities, which my guess is a lot of you would agree. And I'll leave you with this meditation from Rudolf Steiner, which I think indicates the path we must follow. I gaze into the darkness. In it, there arises light, living light. Who is this light in the darkness? It is I myself in my reality. This reality of the I does not enter into my earthly life. I am but a picture of it. But I shall find it again when, with goodwill for the spirit, I shall have passed through the gate of death. Thank you.